G'day and welcome to the Ball Boys AFL Fantasy Podcast. Today we are talking about the overvalued premium midfielders, the top tier guys that we think you should probably reconsider putting them in your fantasy squad. Let's go! G'day again and welcome to the Ball Boys AFL Fantasy Podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Casey, and you can find me on Twitter at Ball Boys Fantasy, and joined once again by my co-host, Luke Rogerson. How are you, man?
Yeah, good. Really good, mate. Huge day today.
Tell me about it.
Speaking of Twitter, you might have, people watching on YouTube might have noticed that
the keen-eye viewers.
Yes, the fraction at the front has changed. It's no longer 1 out of 3, it's 2 out of 3. So the big dog, Roy from the Traders, he's come along. He's following me now on Twitter. So it's just one to go. The Calvinator. We got the sight set on the Calvinator. So,
one to go. One to go. One to go for you.
Yeah. It seems that Roy's giving me the follower, not you, mate.
What's going on here? I mean, are we gonna get two at the same time one of these days?
Yeah. To be fair, I was grovelling and begging and pleading. Wasn't
so what's what it takes.
Perhaps it's you've got to lower your colours to grovelling before the boys get on board.
But next time we'll have 2 separate pieces of paper here, and we'll see how we go. But
in all seriousness, in terms of the Traders. Just quietly, how good is it that the AFL fantasy community's got ambassadors who they're the trailblazers. They're the guys leading the charge. They've been doing it for a long time, and but they're still not too big for little schmucks like you and me. I think that's cool. So in all seriousness, thanks to the Traders, because it's awesome that you guys engage with everyone on Twitter, and even though you could be forgiven for not contributing your time in that way, you guys still do. So really appreciate it.
Yeah, shout out to Warney and the other two. You'll get your shout out later when I get my followers.
Just throwing shade.
No, you guys are legends. But all right, let's get into the podcast today. We're talking overpriced premium midfielders. We've already done our underpriced premium midfielders. So if you haven't already, go and check that video or podcast out. If you miss it, it's a bit of a cracker, if I do say so myself.
Yeah.
Our longest podcast yet, because there's lots to talk about, obviously. Probably could have gone for another half an hour, really. But go and check that one out. But today we're talking about the guys that are overpriced, and at the end, we're also going to be breaking down our top 8 mids. So the players that we think are going to be the top 8 at the end of the year, and for what it's worth, and who you should maybe target there if there's anyone of value.
Yeah, and little disclaimer on this video. I think I said it at the start of one of our other ones as well. Don't get it twisted. The players we're going to talk about today, they're guns.
Oh, they're good.
They're going to be big scorers.
They're priced highly for a reason.
That's it. So we're suggesting that perhaps these are guys that you're not looking to have in your starting squad, but you're keeping an eye on them to see if that value drops. So don't get that twisted. We still like these guys as fantasy players, maybe just not from the start. That's all.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to throw it over to you, Luke. Who is our first guy we're talking about here?
We're talking about the big dog, the biggest of the dogs.
The biggest of the dogs.
So if you played...
Not Warn Dog, but...
not quite that big, no. But the player we're talking about is Rory Laird. So for anyone who played fantasy last year, you'll know all about this bloke. He averaged 120 for the season.
120.3 for the season.
For the season, which is just insanity. So he's the $1 million man that you can pick up in fantasy this season. And there are a few people out there, Mitch, that are suggesting that perhaps he still presents value at 120, which is just insanity if that's the case. What are your thoughts there?
The thoughts there, obviously, you look at his season, right? He missed the first 2 rounds.
Yep.
I'm trying to remember, was that a wrist or something like that potentially, or a hand injury? There was something there. I can't quite remember exactly what it was. Came in the first couple of games, 90, 123, 95, 110, and it was always the kind of joke that he was consistently getting you hundreds, between 100 and 120, but not really getting those ceiling scores. And then the second half of the season came around.
Ceiling scores, Christ.
He went bang, and it was a big average. After the buys, averaged 128.7 for 10 games. Only dropped below 116 once. So you consider, those are all captain scores.
Mate, you're convincing me to pick him.
They're all captain scores. Lowest, only dropped under that score once, and that was for a measly 92. So it's
pretty crazy.
It's pretty good.
So these stats, you're probably sitting there thinking, hang on, Mitch has just convinced me to pick him. But what we're suggesting here is that he would have to reach those heights and beyond to present any value at the start of the year. So yes, maybe he will. And if he does, all power to him. But if he doesn't, you could pick him up at a discounted price. And then if he does something similar to last year, where he goes bang after the buys, you can pick him up around that buy period, and then you can just see all the benefit of those huge scores later in the season.
Yep.
There was a little bit of a stat getting around on Twitter about a week ago as well that we both saw that suggests that perhaps that top scoring premium midfielder each year doesn't necessarily go on to see those heights again the following year. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so again, I apologise. I can't remember the account that tweeted out those stats. So if it was you, let us know and we'll give you a shout out or something like that. But I think that the takeaway message was the average fall in price for the next year was close to that sort of 10 to 15 points. I think there was only 2 players that increased their average after becoming the number one scorer in fantasy the year before, and that was Brodie Grundy, I think, in one year, and then Tom Mitchell, where he went back-to-back, I think 127 and 129. Grundy went from maybe a 120 to a 122. So even in those instances, it's a small increase. It's nothing big.
You'd be doing incredibly well to increase significantly on 120, wouldn't you?
That's right.
There is one thing, we will kind of play devil's advocate and talk about both sides a little bit. The one thing that if you were going to pick up Laird and you thought, I really want to pick him up, there is, in my mind, there's one thing that suggests that potentially it could be an all right move, and that's just the fact that I don't see him as a tag target or a player that teams are necessarily going to go after tag-wise.
You're probably going for Dawson before him, hey?
Yeah, and then even if you do tag Laird, the way he scores his points, it doesn't necessarily lend itself to
tackles,
something you can shut down anyway. So, there are a couple of things that suggest he might be an all right pick, but in my opinion, and I think in your opinion as well, there's not enough value there.
Yeah, I'd like to compare him to the previous season's version of him, and that was Jack Steele, in my opinion. So Jack Steele had a very similar sort of not tale of two halves, but he definitely had that explosion in the second half of last year. A lot of people started with him in 2022. So at the end of the 2021 season, we all sort of said he's priced at 120, but at his back half of the year, this is how he went. 114, 157, 138, 149, 106, 162, 139. Didn't drop below 100 in any of those games. So probably even better than a Rory Laird. And yet, I know he had the injury to his shoulder, but even before that, he was underwhelming. Not bad by any stretch. He still put up decent scores, 107, 105, 101, 130, 112, 110 to start the season, but it was still below his average, below what you paid for him. And so ultimately, it was a bit of a disappointing pick for those that went with him at the start of the season, because you've used all that money on a player like Jack Steele. And whereas you could have spread that out and other few guys gotten that value and still probably been able to pick captains each week that matched or bettered his average. Yeah. And I think that is kind of how I see it playing out with a Rory Laird. They're both very similar in play styles, like big tacklers.
Yep.
Typically, you wouldn't expect Jack Steele to be a tag target as well. It's just something about those first few rounds of the season that often, like we've spoken about before, teams are feeling things out.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It kind of speaks to a point that I made on a couple of podcasts ago, was these guys we're talking about, they're big dog premium players. They're not just good fantasy players. They're great players in the AFL. And those guys just have a way of timing their run and building into a season. Like a Rory Laird, an Andrew Brayshaw, a Took Miller, a Jack Steele, they know that, they're not going to win a flag.
They're not going to win round one, are they? Three rounds,
so they just they build into their season, and it kind of, you naturally see that in their fantasy scores too.
Yeah, and I think that there might be something to it. I might be reaching a little bit here, but there might be something to it with those big gun tacklers early in the season, and I don't have any evidence.
You reckon they're going to warm up the shoulders a bit?
Well, no, I reckon the game style doesn't favour those kind of guys. The weather's warmer. Teams are maybe kicking the ball around a bit more freely. I feel like the pace of the game, I don't know, especially in the last couple of years, seems faster.
You reckon it's like the NBA regular season? Well, no one starts playing.
Like a couple of years ago, we had that the man on the mark rule, and everything was playing off half back and all those sort of things. I remember that game against Sydney, Richmond versus Sydney, and the ball was flinging across all over the ground.
Yeah, teams start to. I guess
in those colder months, it's sometimes wet and things like that, and you get those higher tackle games typically towards the back end of the season. But
what you're saying, I guess, as well, is that teams start to hone their defensive strategy as the season goes on.
Yeah, coaches make adjustments. They move the magnets around.
So these points we're making, they'll kind of apply to some of the next guys that we talk about as well. Who have we got next, Mitch?
The next guy on my list here is, I feel bad talking about this guy negatively because
he was my love child, mate.
He was my favourite pick of last year.
For good reason, too.
And I love the way he goes about it. Andrew Brayshaw, I think, is an overpriced premium midfielder this year. Look, I love the guy. He's an absolute gun. Love the way he goes about it. The complete opposite of a guy who puts his head down and sulks. He goes after it every game, no matter how well his team's doing. I just think that I didn't expect him to do as well as he did last year, even though I picked him.
He increased by 10 points last year, so he went from 2021 104 to 113. So you kind of, when they're at that ceiling, do you see that happening again? It's kind of hard to imagine that kind of improvement happening again.
He had a game where he scored 181 points.
Again, you're convincing me to pick him.
Well, what I'm saying that is do you expect that to be? Do you expect that to happen again? Look, he's capable.
Oh, no doubt.
But that's a very high bar, and obviously none of his scores, like he did have a 140 and a few 120s and a 130 in there, but nothing was 40 points close to that score. It's very much the outlier, and it does lift his average just a little bit more than I expect him. I still think he's probably a 110 guy, and he'll be very much, again, spoiler alert for my top 8, he'll be very much in the mix.
Definitely.
But whether he can improve on that, I just have my doubts.
Yeah, and so last season he went at 76% CBAs. So again, it's hard to see that going up significantly. Maybe he nudges the 80s. But let's have a look at it through a lens of an opposition team. You come in to play Fremantle. So last year, like you said, he burst onto the scene. But this year, if you're an opposition player playing against Fremantle and you see Andrew Brayshaw running into that gap for that little short kick to set him up across half back or through the midfield, suddenly you're kind of on alert. Do you know what I mean? You now know that's Andrew Brayshaw, and you're probably going to go do something about it.
Coaches are going to be. Well, I mean, they were already kind of onto him, but there was all that thing about Fife early in the season. He was going to be playing, but then he had that injury setback, came in, and I think it's very clear that Fife's the forward and that this season, and Brayshaw is that main man in the middle. So he's very much a tag target. He did see some tags last year, and to his credit, managed to fight his way through a lot of them.
Yeah, because he's a hard worker.
But it's still enough to sort of limit his ceiling a little bit more. So, and like we said before, like these aren't bad picks, but it just means that there's probably better ones out there.
Yeah,
in my opinion,
and the opportunity to get these guys cheaper.
Potentially.
Potentially.
Yes. Yeah, like I said, as long as he doesn't go 181 in his second game, there's a good chance that he is someone that you could jump on maybe for the same or lesser price. And also, we should also mention this as well: the way that the magic number works in AFL Fantasy, because we start with a lot of rookies who outperform their price.
Yep.
I'm not sure if everyone knows this. This is getting pretty nerdy into the stats now. But the total number of dollars in AFL Fantasy is always the same. It always has to equal the same amount of money, right? So when you have a lot of rookies that start so underpriced early in the season, that's when you see big swings in prices.
Doesn't leave room for those premiums too.
So if you just underscore a little bit, it's going to affect your price much more at the start of the season than it would at the end of the season, when there's no longer those high amount of rookies that are debuting, outperforming their price by a lot. So in early parts of the season, you've got to be so confident you're going to go over your price, because if you're just under a little bit, it does actually cause your price to fall a lot more than it would later in the season, when there's not as many debuts and players outperforming their starting price.
It just means you're definitely looking for guys who you think will give you upside, hey?
Yeah, 100%. So it breaks my heart, but Andrew Brayshaw does make the list. As
this next fella is.
As this next guy does.
He's in a similar boat, isn't he? And there's a couple of, we'll talk obviously in more detail, but there's a couple of unknowns with his team as well that I'm a little bit sort of iffy on, and the guy we're talking about is Clayton Oliver. So he performed unbelievably well last season. He went
best season of his career.
Yeah, went at an average of 112. He's only 25, so he's in peak condition.
Yep.
Maybe not aesthetically, but
lay off the man.
But physically, he's in his peak condition. So there's a couple of sort of things that I'm thinking about with Clayton Oliver. what does Petracca do next season? So will Simon Goodwin and his coaching staff have decided that Petracca is going to be like a little bit more forward? Does that give Clayton Oliver the run of the midfield? But then there's also a fella that we liked in our Defenders podcast who we think is now going to be spending more time in the midfield, and that's the other Brayshaw, Angus Brayshaw. So there's a couple of unknowns there with Clayton Oliver, and because of those unknowns and the fact that he scored really well last year, it just, to me, would not be a safe selection when there's so many other midfielders that present value. Your thoughts? I
think those are all fair. Like, Clayton Oliver, again, he's a gun.
Yep.
I honestly think he's one of the best players in the AFL. He probably is the best at what he does. He is probably, if I was to rank players in terms of the ones that are the most untaggable, Clayton Oliver is probably one or two on that list. Like, he is so, the size of him, his work ethic, and his clean hands. He's a gun, and it shows in his scores. Like, his scores are so consistent. He had one score at 68 versus the Port Adelaide Power in round 4, but other than that, his lowest score was 87. He only had 3 other scores below 100 for the whole year. So 4 scores under 100 for the entire season, including finals. So 25 rounds. It's just a remarkably consistent kind of player. I'm not so worried about maybe Brayshaw going in there, and I think Clayton Oliver is going to be Clayton Oliver, and he's going to be in there. I don't think that's going to change. The one thing that I might be a little bit concerned of is if Petracca's maybe playing a bit more forward time, that the tags come to Clayton Oliver a bit more consistently, because, you know, he and Petracca share those tags sometimes, and they might tag one for a quarter and the other for another quarter, whereas it might stay on Oliver a little bit longer. In saying that, like I said, he's probably one of the guys that you can't really tag the most, but it's still enough to just shave off a little bit of that ceiling score. And again, when we're really nitpicking at the top of the price, the other thing is last year was his best. It was his career year. He's never gone above 110 before. Goes at 112.5. Yes, he's 25. He's still young and could improve again. But I just think, like I said before, there are other guys that I just think are better options, and
with more upside.
Don't see Clayton Oliver. Like, it wouldn't surprise me if he comes out and does 115. Like, that wouldn't shock me. But again, it's 2.5 points
exactly,
upside.
That's it. That's the thing with all of these blokes. It's like, even if they go upside, they're
2.5
limited
points
to that kind of range.
Could you do better? And I think you can. So I think that's a pretty clear one for me.
Now, Callum Mills from the Swannies, he is obviously, fits this overpriced premium category as well. But there's a couple of little things about the way he's played and the way he's utilised on game day that can kind of probably scare you off a little bit at this price. So he's priced at 111, which is 983k, and some of you out there will know what I'm referencing. But he's just such a versatile player. He's a victim of being so good at so many things that when there's gaps to be filled, Horst Longmire just fills the gaps with Callum Mills. He may as well be called Sellies, because he's just filling gaps. You like that one?
That almost went over my head. That was that bad.
Jeez, I'm doing these on the spot, so this is good gear.
I think Grasshopper was your better one. I think, I agree with you. Like, I have look, speaking from, you had your moment with Darcy Parish the other day. This is my moment with Callum Mills here.
The captain choice. Tell us about
I have a love-hate relationship with Callum Mills. He was my first upgrade of the season last year, and the first week that I got him in, he pumps out a 160 for me, catapulting me up to top 300 early in the season. But the end of the season, when I'm pulling my hair out about my captain's choices, he unfortunately has the tendency to sometimes not play the role that you want him to play, and he pumps out a score like a 54.
I think, just to rub salt in the wounds, I'm pretty sure Clayton Oliver went like 130 that week.
Those were my two options that year, and if I trace back, the difference between me having this hat and another hat is that freaking captain choice.
Mate, shoulda, coulda, woulda.
And and you can attest this.
No,
I was
can.
weighing up between those two.
Yeah, he's not taking the piss here.
And of course, I picked the one. It cost me 80 points, and it cost me a hat.
You can't look back like that, mate. You just kill yourself.
There's obviously so many things that a season can boil down to, but I remember that one specifically, and it still hurts to this day.
It proves the point we're trying to make, isn't it? That he's so versatile, and that if the game demands it, his coach isn't afraid to put him in a position where, and I mean, like, you can't begrudge a coach for doing that. They're trying to win the game. They don't care about our fantasy scores.
The other thing I will say though about Callum Mills is that there was a very distinct trend in the second half of the season. His CBA percentages dropped fairly significantly. I don't have the exact averages right in front of me. I might be able to get that up in a second, but after the buys, there's a very clear, distinct drop, 57, 65, 50, 55, 55, a game where he had 28% CBAs. When they started to get a few more of those younger blokes in there, Chad Warner was a more prominent feature in there. For some reason, Tom Papley was in there a bit more after the buys. Don't really get that one.
He's pretty explosive when he goes in there.
But Callum Mills, come on.
I think you're just looking at the fantasy lens.
Well, maybe, I don't know, but it's just there's a trend that I don't like, and I can see, like we've said before, he is so good at so many things. When you've got other guys that maybe can only play in the inside midfield, that he is the guy that suffers as a result of that. So for me, I actually project him losing a few points this season if that trend continues, and I think it kind of will, because they do have a few young up and coming guys that I think maybe are fighting for more inside time.
Yeah, and he's the consummate professional as well, isn't he?
He's so good.
Yeah, if he gets asked to play the role, he plays the role, no head tilting or anything like that. Yep. So this next fellow we're going to talk about, Zach Merritt.
Merritt.
Just looking at his stats here,
Matty Mopson's favourite player.
Well, we'll yeah. I mean, what was that story? That was
172 with the big C on him.
120 in the second half.
Yeah, I think it was on 35 at half time, and then
he would have had his heart in his mouth. Hey?
Oh yeah, I couldn't imagine that.
Now, in terms of Zach Merritt,
funny Callum Mills could do that.
He's still salty.
Anyway,
there's a case to be made where Zach Merritt, you could actually see close to 10 points of upside, but you really have to reach for it. So looking at so his average last year was 107, okay, with that ceiling of 172. Now there's people who'll go right back to 2017 and 2016 where Merritt went at 115 and 117 respectively and say, hey, there's 10 points of upside. But to me, if you're having to reach back like 5 years, and that's
2016 we're talking about.
Yeah, so that's
2023.
Yeah, so if you're having to reach back that far to justify your upside, there's probably a few question marks on that. Hey, new coach. Be interesting to see what Brad Scott does with he and Parrish. But again, these guys are so expensive that you could justify it, but maybe you're only getting 3 or 4 points of upside when there's guys you could do better with.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, hey. And the Bombers, to me, I'm not... They're one of the teams that I just don't really know what they're going to do with their midfield. Yeah. Like Merritt was in there for the season, 68% CBAs. It's not a low number.
But it's not like elite.
He could be higher. Yeah. But I've heard a lot of whispers of players like Archie Perkins, Ben Hobbs, wanting to get in there.
And new coach just exacerbates that unknown, doesn't it?
There's a lot of criticism surrounding the Bombers and their game style, and them having a lot of players that are very like for like. Parrish, Merritt, being that kind of similar, offensive-minded midfielder, that accumulator type, without having that defensive presence or that guy that breaks the lines and explodes out of the midfield. So, for me, if it's going to be one of those guys that comes out of the midfield, it's going to be Merritt before Parrish. I think Parrish
comes is removed, comes
reduces, sees their role decreased.
Yeah, and Parrish is cheaper anyway. So
Parrish is cheaper. He's younger, so I think I see more upside in a player like Parrish.
Yeah,
Merritt. Like I said, maybe there's 2 points or so upside, but again, he's kind of a player that I think he pretty much is what he is, and there is that element of risk that it does change in this upcoming season. So
he could go huge, but there's every chance he doesn't as well. And this next bloke on the list, you actually can't pick him because based on the stats I've got here, he's 30. So
who are we talking about?
Lachie Neale.
Oh,
but I think that other than the fact that he's a little bit older, the other thing that probably, in my mind, excludes you picking Lachie Neale at this price is the fact that they've added Dunkley. So I'm not going to say I'm not going to say that Neale's score drops, but do I see Neale presenting value where he's going to go up 5 to 10 points? Probably not. It's me saying that that Dunkley's coming along doesn't mean Neale's not a good player or that Neale's role's going to change. I think his role will still stay the same. I just don't know if I see his scoring increasing.
Yeah, I think the other thing that sticks in a lot of people's mind is that 2020 year he just went absolutely bananas. Averaged 98 in obviously the short quarters, which adjusted close to about 120. You can kind of almost not throw it out, but it's not as applicable to this game style. When he was playing 95% of game time in those games, I don't really think you can sort of say that that's his true ceiling that he's done before. No. So his only other ceiling that a season that he's averaged more than the 170 put up last season was back in 2016 when he was a part of the Freo Dockers. And of course, back then he was the guy that wasn't getting tagged because you're tagging Fife. He's the guy that defenses are going to be clued in on. He gets tagged like every third week because it's so obvious. I don't think Dunkley's coming in and changing that. And I think that, like we sort of said, at age... He's 29, by the way, and 7 months.
When does he... Well, that means he turns 30 in the year.
In the season, yeah. So
you'll...
look, I'm not picking him, but as part of the 30 rule, he clears it. It's okay. He's 29 at the start of the season. But
I love that you jumped on and quickly fact-checked that too.
I'm very quick to defend my rules here. But I think you're not going to see him improve, right? I think he kind of is what he is. He's a gun player. He's a Brownlow medalist. But, we kind of see those guys that are maybe better at football than they are at fantasy because of the attention that they draw. Yep. I think Lachie Neale falls under that camp, and he'll be there amount. Like, I still think he's going to average more than 100, probably close to that 105 mark, but I don't see him going 110, 115, which is probably what you'd want him to do if you're picking him around that price.
Certainly.
So, moving on from Lachie Neale to the next guy that we've got here. Really a bit of a surprise. I'm not sure if people are aware of how good of a season this guy had, but Brad Crouch is a guy I just want to touch on real quick. I don't know if many people are actually considering picking him.
He's sneaky good, isn't he?
He's sneaky good, so some people might be trying to be a bit clever and select Brad Crouch, but I just think that with the change in game style, or not the change in game, but the new coach, the fact that he hasn't really ever done anything like that before. I think he had one season when he came back from injury that he put up a decent average, but I just think that like we said, there's so many other better picks, and he'd be the kind of guy that I could see someone picking to be unique for the sake of being unique.
Yeah, and,
I just don't think that that's what we should be doing.
Yep, agree on that one.
So I think he's a pretty easy scratch for that one there.
This next guy might not be as easy to scratch.
Not as obvious.
Yeah, and there'll be definitely some people who get behind this fella. It's just, to me, it's sort of dependent on role. And I'm talking about Christian Petracca. Mm-hmm. Now, I know you've got a little bit to say about him, so I might let you lead off.
Well, I just want to firstly say that I think that Christian Petracca is the best player in the game. Like, I honestly, I think he's an absolute jet and absolute gun.
You realise he doesn't play for Richmond, right?
I know that. I know, yeah. Maybe I should, Well, I mean, I'm taking off my Richmond hat. I was going to say,
don't let Ellie hear you say that.
I won't say. I think I've said it a few times, but he's that perfect modern type player that is more. And we've seen it in the past with players that better maybe in that other format, the Supercoach format, or better in real life footy than they are in fantasy, because obviously they draw attention and it's more quality over quantity sometimes, because he's that guy that can be damaging up forward, break lines. Everything he does is classy, but a kick is a kick in fantasy. You know what I mean? A mark is a mark. Whether it's contested or uncontested, or if you get a clearance or you don't get a clearance in fantasy, it doesn't matter. And I think obviously the inkling that I'm getting for Melbourne is they want to see him not completely out of the midfield, but maybe reducing his centre bounces a little bit, having him play a bit more of that forward role.
25 touches and 4 goals is a better stat line for Christian Petracca than 35 and a goal. Yep. Do you know what I mean? Yep. So that's the new wave of prototype midfielder, is that midfielder that doesn't just rack up the pill for fun, but it racks it up a little bit and then hits the scoreboard.
And we've seen this before. I know he gets compared to him a lot, but I think that Dusty is obviously the the hallmark of this kind of a player. And we've seen that, he obviously had his breakout season in 2017, averaged 114 points. The next season, 93. Now,
I don't think Richmond cares much for fantasy.
Richmond has had a great season that year. They were amazing, and Dusty did his thing, and it was not like he stepped back from like an AFL impact point of view, but from a fantasy point of view, the difference is huge. And I think that there is a risk that Christian Petracca follows a similar kind of path, especially if he finds himself playing a bit more of that sort of start, middle, head forward.
They have such elite midfielders. It's a no-brainer to play him in that. If you've got Oliver and Brayshaw there, it's like Petracca's got to be forward to centre.
That's Brayshaw's role. That's Oliver's role. And he can be more damaging up forward. He needs to be that guy to catch it, to get it inside 50 or catching it in the 50 himself and scoring goals rather than getting cheap ball at the back. And I think that they realise that with them not succeeding last year and winning the flag after their hot start.
So let me throw you a hypothetical. If you watch throughout the preseason and Petracca's playing high midfield time, high CBAs, and he's killing it, is there a world where you pick him valued at 102? Or
I think there's obviously a world that he improves on this price.
Yeah.
It's definitely like he's not expensive by a huge stretch, but again, if I just resort back to the other options around his price, there are so many more players that I will find myself gravitating towards, like a Bontempelli, a Darcy Parish, a Josh Kelly. Like these guys are more your classical accumulators. Bailey Smith is pretty close in that price as well. So these kind of guys, I think, just have a higher ceiling, and I'm more confident that their role is not going to shift throughout the season, maybe with the exception of Josh Kelly. So I just think that even if the upside does prove to be there, is it as good as those other guys? They don't have quite the downside that I think the Petracca might have. So I'm not ruling out the fact that he could be better than his price, but I just think there's a lot of risk there. Would be my point of view.
I think that's a fair take on that one.
Last one,
lucky last, the Cripper.
Yeah, the reigning Brownlow medalist.
I think Roy had him going at 150 or something, didn't he?
I think that was
his Carlton podcast.
the Carlton coloured glasses. So Patrick Cripps, again, I'll put a bit of history on my experience with Patrick Cripps. I started without him last season, never had him in my team.
And it hurt you, didn't it?
It did hurt me at the start of the season. He's, again, one of those players, very similar to Petracca, a better AFL player than a fantasy player traditionally. Now, he went absolutely beast mode last year. It was probably, would you agree, it's like he was his best season of his career?
Yeah, and both fantasy impact and footy impact as well.
He had a season in 2018 where he put up 109 in 2018. Again, we're going back 5 years now.
Yeah, reaching. He's impactful. I guess he's similar in a way to Christian Petracca, isn't he? They're both big, huge bull midfielders that want to go forward. They want to break the lines. They want to kick goals.
There doesn't seem to be quite the narrative with Patrick Cripps playing forward as there is with Petracca.
And that could be to do with... I was going to say it could be to do with Cattle in the midfield, but
Carl's got a great midfield.
Yeah, Walsh isn't going to start the season.
Not going to be there.
But they do have a great midfield. You're right.
Maybe he's not quite as dynamic of a forward. Like, I feel like he's more brute strength. Petracca's a bit more fleet of foot.
Yeah, sometimes he goes forward and he looks good. He just like beast mode some of those smaller defenders out of the road.
Unit, absolutely.
But all those things said, it's just comes down to the same old story. I don't have the confidence with him valued at 102 that we're going to see 10 points of upside.
He was 83% CBAs last year.
So it's like he's not going to increase drastically with CBAs. Yep.
That's including a game where he got injured in round 4 on 32%. So really he's like 85% CBAs. Yeah. Like he's one of the highest CBA guys in the comp. Yeah. So you don't really have the upside there.
You just don't see where it's going to come from, do you? Where's
he going to come from? He doesn't get the easy ball. He gets everything the hard way. And the Brownlow curse is a real thing.
We saw that, didn't we?
Yeah, obviously Ollie Wines proved that. Dusty proved that.
And some little like historical injury kind of things with Cripper as well. Maybe not so much last year, but
shoulders, backs, soft tissue, had the hamstring last year.
So at that price, it just kind of he was a great pick last year, but this year, maybe not so much.
Yeah, I can see the narratives there, but I just think again, there's just better options that I think are much safer and have a higher ceiling than a Patrick Cripps, who obviously is a gun in real life, but I think, and obviously again, better in the Supercoach formats that reward those kind of clearances and contested possessions and all those contested marks and things like that. But again, a kick's a kick, a mark's a mark in fantasy, and it's it's much better to get it the easy way than the hard way in fantasy. So those are our overpriced premium midfielders. Obviously, there are more that we think are overpriced, but I think we just wanted to touch on probably the most popular ones today, and maybe the ones that you might be considering. I don't think I see many people considering Jack Viney as an option.
I wouldn't have thought so. And if for the people out there, if you have a difference of opinion to us, or you want to give some more information, please comment on the YouTube channel, because we always love to get more intel and see what people.
If you have any questions about players specifically that you want to ask and get our thoughts on that we haven't covered in these last couple of podcasts, drop them down in the comments. Happy to have that discussion with you guys. I think we had a good chat with a commenter about Jaden Short before the most recent podcast. So
for sure.
Yeah, it's we love to have those chats. So last to wrap up the podcast today, we're going to go through our top 8 mids. So we're slowly doing the rolling 22, I guess, across several weeks. So we did our top 6 defenders in the Overpriced Defenders podcast. Now we'll do the midfielders. I think you let us off last time.
Yeah,
so,
you're going first this time because I'm certain you copied me last time.
Yeah, okay, all right. See if you can copy me this time. So, all right, top 8 mids in order. Okay, ranked in order.
Give them to me.
I've got number 1. I know it's vanilla. It's Rory Laird. I have him. And again, I'm putting a number to all these guys, just for funsies. Why not?
That was like an average.
Yeah, just to average, a projected average. I've got him going 117, so dropping back a few points. Number 2, I have Jack Steele. I have him going 115 this season, followed by Touk Miller at 114 at number 3. Yep. Number 4, again, you're seeing a lot of names that appeared on our podcast are being overpriced, but they're still guns. Clayton Oliver. I've got him going about a 112. And then I've got maybe the first surprise of the list. At number 5, I have Bailey Smith, which, again, might be a hot take.
Yeah, well, if you listen to our previous podcast, it's something that Mitch is
you
really
might be aware,
on.
yes. But I'm very keen on Bailey Smith this year.
Yeah, I think you have to make those bold predictions, but that makes it fun.
Yeah, I think I haven't heard him being spoken about much before. I think our most recent listener, Roy, had him in his little team that I noticed there.
Obviously
in his midfield,
thinks he presents a little bit of value as well.
So, Roy, let me know what you think about Bailey Smith. But I think he can absolutely go. I've got him pegged at 112, so kind of right alongside Clayton Oliver there.
Yeah.
He's done it in stretches. Number 6, I've got my boy from last year, Andrew Brayshaw, going at about 110.
Yeah.
So that's me with 6 players going 110 or above. The rest of the guys, I think the next group is a very big clump of players.
Okay.
So I kind of see them as a pretty locked-in top 6. The next couple guys, you could mix and match a lot of them. But at 7, I've gone with Callum Mills.
Yep.
I've got him going at about 108, 107, and same with Zach Merritt, sort of a 107, 108, sort of a range there. So obviously a lot of honorable mentions there. I won't go through the whole list, but that's where I cut it off. What are your thoughts on my list?
Good to know we're sort of on the same page. We haven't consulted each other about these lists, but 7 of the 8 guys I also have on my list with the one that you don't have as being maybe a surprise. Some people I think I've heard have him on the list as well. So the first 7 I'll read out there, same as Mitch, but they're just in a slightly different order. So I had Steele as getting back to the heights that he reached in 2021.
I considered that. Yep.
So as number 1, and then Laird followed closely second. I just I don't see a world where Rory Laird drops off a cliff. I know there's those stats about the fact that the top averaging player sometimes drops away, but he's just such a beast. He gets his points in the right way, if that makes any sense. And I think he's number 2.
Yeah.
Now I've gone a little bit more bullish. I think I might be hanging out with you too much because I've actually got Bailey Smith at number 3.
Oh, okay.
I think your takes are contagious because once I started digging in, I really like the look of it. Although maybe I don't agree with some of his personal choices.
Wow. We're not selecting him for his for what he does in the on the weekends after the game.
But I think as far as on-field stuff goes, he could be the number 3 ranked midi. Then the Tookster. The Took at number 4. I've got Mills at 5. Oliver there at 6. So for me, Took, Mills, and Oliver, like you said, throw the dice out.
Pretty blanket kind of.
Yeah, that's
it.
It yeah, it could go in any order. And then I've got Brayshaw as having a little bit of a drop, coming off his big breakout season. So I've got him in at 7. And then instead of having Merritt in at 8, I've got Tommy Mitchell to hopefully get back to not quite the heights that he saw in his best seasons, but I think he could be a top 8 defender. Top 8 midfielder, sorry.
he was a honourable mention for me, and I find it pretty tough to sort of place a projected average on Tom Mitchell.
Yep.
It wouldn't shock me if he comes out and does a 115. It would definitely shock me if he comes out and does a 120 plus again. I don't think that's on the cards, but I can definitely see him being in that sort of Took Miller, Clayton Oliver kind of a range. For the sake of this 8, I just had him just outside. So don't disagree too much there at all. So we're very much on the same page with that one.
Pretty similar.
Bailey Smith, huh? Number 3.
Yeah, so
you're going to be waving that flag now.
Oh, definitely. I'll be getting behind him. But we talked about it on our previous podcast. He just works so hard. When he's on the field, you never feel like there's a time in the game where he's not hunting the football.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So if he, like you mentioned, if he reaches back to those like high 80, 90% time on ground stats, you can pretty much back him to just be finding the pill the whole time he's out there.
Yeah.
And the other thing too is you see every touch because that mullet is flowing about a metre behind him.
Not hard to miss,
it's
is
like a cape.
And I think there's something to be said about those guys that are younger, and he's got a point to prove.
Oh, definitely after last year.
Especially like early in the season, right? Like we talked about the price movements being bigger early in the season. I think it's important, like, Andrew Brayshaw started the season last year with like a house on fire. He's got a point to prove to take that next step forward.
Yeah.
The Bulldogs disappointed a bit last year, bounced out after the first finals. He obviously had those off-court issues.
Off-court issues.
So off-field issues. I'm in basketball, recorded the Fantasy Basketball podcast earlier, but he's... I think he's got a point to prove, and he wants to. I can easily see him coming out and just really hunting the footy, and obviously he did it last year. So he's got that history of starting like a house on fire,
and he kind of doesn't
get away from you.
He kind of doesn't fall into that category I mentioned before of those like uber premiums that are just easing their way into a season. Like you said, he's got a point to prove. A couple of indiscretions last year that he'll be looking to make amends for. So I see him coming out hard.
I want to maybe just point out one player that neither of us had on our list. Jack McRae was on neither of our lists, and I think he's on most people's top 8 mids. Was he close to the?
Yeah, he was. He was in consideration. I don't know. What do you say? These guys are all guns. It's like if you got
to draw a line somewhere,
then you don't pick someone else. So
where do you, in terms of like an average, like where would you say
average wise? What's he priced at? Maybe 105.
Yeah, okay. I think I see him, between that 105, 110 mark. It's tough. Like, I think he's underpriced, but I also think that in terms of the other Bulldogs, he's probably the lowest. I think he's going to benefit the least from Dunkley moving on, because he was already higher up in the CBAs compared to a Bont, compared to a Bailey Smith. So I think in terms of taking that next step forward, again, I know he's done the 116s, the 120s in the past, but just because he's done it previously doesn't necessarily mean he's going to do it this season. So interesting. I just wanted to make a note that
look at us. We've gone and turned this podcast into a Bulldogs podcast.
I tell you what, I could talk about them all day. But lots to watch there. But that might do it for us there, guys. Let us know what your top 8 is down in the comment section below on YouTube, or tweet at us if you want to have a discussion over there as well. Looking at you, Roy. And make sure you guys are subscribed to the YouTube channel. Next podcast, we're going to be talking about some mid-prices. There are actually a lot of mid-priced mids that we need to talk about today that should definitely be in consideration for your team. So look out for that one there, guys. Give this video a big thumbs up. Give us a 5-star rating as well if you're listening on podcasts, and we'll see you next time. Bye.